Absolutely, here is the first one, 000 word segment, written to flow naturally into the larger speech and set up the later points around emotional depth and self-respect. There is something deeply unsettling to a man about a woman who wants his attention but doesn't depend on it. And I want you to understand the distinction because it changes everything. Wanting someone is not weakness. Wanting connection is not desperation. Wanting to be loved, desired, chosen, and appreciated is part of being human. The problem begins when wanting someone becomes needing their attention in order to feel valuable. Because the moment your sense of worth becomes dependent on another person's response, you stop relating to them freely. You start monitoring them. You notice how quickly they reply. You analyze the punctuation in their messages. You wonder why they watched your story but didn't respond. You ask yourself whether they are losing interest. You start changing your behavior based on tiny fluctuations in their attention. And suddenly, instead of living your life and allowing a relationship to develop naturally, your emotional world begins revolving around one question: does he still want me? Now compare that with a woman who asks a completely different question: do I still want this? That shift is enormous. Because one question places him at the center of your emotional universe, the other places you back at the center of your own. And men can feel that difference. They may not be able to articulate it. They may not sit down and think. Her internal locus of validation appears to be independent of my approval. But psychologically, they experience it. They experience a woman who doesn't immediately collapse when they become busy. A woman who doesn't panic when there is a little distance. A woman who doesn't suddenly become more agreeable because she senses him pulling away. A woman who doesn't abandon her plans because he finally became available. And here's where something fascinating happens. When you are not desperately trying to secure someone's attention, you become much more capable of giving them your genuine attention. You can actually listen. You can flirt without calculating. You can enjoy a conversation without wondering where it's going. You can tell him you like him without feeling that you've surrendered your power, because you're not giving from a place of fear. You're giving from a place of choice, and there is a philosophical difference between those two things. Fear says, I need to do this so I don't lose him. Choice says, I want to do this because it reflects who I am. The behavior may look identical from the outside, but emotionally they are completely different experiences. Think about affection. A woman who sends a loving message because she genuinely feels affectionate creates one kind of energy. A woman who sends the same message because she hasn't heard from him for 6 hours and is hoping the message will restore his interest creates another. The words might be identical, the psychology isn't, because people don't only respond to what we say. They respond to the emotional position from which we say it. This is why pretending to be unavailable doesn't work nearly as well as actually having a life. There is a huge difference between saying, I'm going to wait 3 hours before replying because I want him to think I'm busy, and genuinely being busy because your life contains things that matter to you. One is strategy, the other is identity. And strategy eventually becomes exhausting because you have to maintain it. Identity doesn't require maintenance. If you genuinely value your friendships, your work, your interests, your health, your creativity, your goals, your family, your solitude, then a relationship becomes part of your life rather than the entire definition of it. and that is attractive for a deeper reason than simple scarcity. It tells another person that if they enter your life, they are entering something already alive. They are not being asked to become your entire world. They are being invited to become part of it. That is a much healthier form of intimacy. Because healthy love isn't two empty people desperately trying to complete one another. It is two whole people choosing to share something. And this is where many people misunderstand attraction. They think attraction is created by making someone afraid of losing you. But the strongest version of attraction isn't manufactured fear. It is the recognition of value. When a man encounters a woman who has genuine standards, genuine interests, genuine friendships, and genuine emotional stability, he begins to understand that her affection isn't something he automatically owns. It is something he has the opportunity to cultivate. That distinction matters because entitlement kills appreciation. When someone believes your attention is guaranteed, they can stop noticing its value. But when someone realizes your attention is freely given rather than desperately attached, they become more conscious of what it means to receive it. And I want to be very clear here. This does not mean playing games. It doesn't mean ignoring his messages. It doesn't mean withholding affection. It doesn't mean pretending you don't care. It doesn't mean becoming emotionally cold so that he chases you. In fact, those behaviors often come from the exact insecurity we're trying to escape. Real independence is much quieter. It looks like answering when you have time, saying what you mean, having plans you don't cancel unnecessarily. Expressing interest without overinvesting before trust has been established, letting someone show you who they are instead of trying to convince them to become the person you hope they will be. And perhaps most importantly, it means understanding that rejection is information, not a verdict on your worth. If a man doesn't choose you, it may hurt. Of course it will hurt. You're human, but pain and humiliation are not the same thing. Disappointment and worthlessness are not the same thing. Someone saying, "I don't want this relationship," does not mean you are not valuable. It means the relationship wasn't mutually chosen. And emotionally mature people learn to survive that distinction, because once you stop interpreting every man's interest as a measurement of your worth, dating becomes radically different. You stop auditioning, you start observing. Instead of thinking, "How can I make him like me?" you begin asking, "How do I feel around him?" Instead of, "What should I say so he doesn't lose interest?" you ask, "Can I be myself here?" Instead of, "How do I make him chase me?" you ask, "Is he actually showing the consistency, effort, and character that I want in a partner?" And that is the point where you become different. Not because you've mastered some secret technique, not because you've learned how to manipulate male psychology, but because you've stopped treating yourself like a product waiting to be selected. You become a person doing the selecting too. And that changes the entire emotional atmosphere of a relationship. A man may become curious about you because you're not constantly seeking his attention. But if that curiosity develops into something meaningful, it will be because he discovers something beneath that independence: warmth, intelligence, emotional depth, playfulness, compassion, and standards. And that's where we have to go next, because independence alone isn't the goal. Being difficult to reach isn't the goal. The goal is to be deeply available to the right person without being desperately available to anyone. That's a very different kind of woman. She doesn't say, "You can't have me." She says, through the way she lives, you can know me, but you have to meet me where I am. And perhaps that is what shakes him most. Not that she doesn't need him, but that she could genuinely love him without ever needing to lose herself in him. And when a man encounters a woman who can give love freely without surrendering her identity, he doesn't simply experience attraction. He encounters a woman he has to respect, and that is where real connection begins. Absolutely, this section naturally follows the first point by moving from independence, into emotional intelligence and psychological safety, while setting up the final point about standards and walking away. And once you stop needing his attention to tell you that you're valuable, something else becomes possible. You can finally see him, not the version of him you've imagined, not the version you hope he becomes, not the version you need him to be in order to justify your feelings, him, and that is a surprisingly rare ability in relationships. Because most of us don't simply see another person. We see them through the lens of our own fears, expectations, disappointments, and desires. He doesn't text for a few hours, and suddenly you're not just observing a behavior, you're creating a story. He's losing interest. He's talking to someone else. I must have done something wrong. He doesn't care. And before he's even had the opportunity to explain himself, you've already reacted to a story that exists primarily inside your own mind. Emotional intelligence begins when you learn to create a space between what happened and what you assume it means. That's powerful, because a woman who can do this doesn't immediately punish a man for every emotional discomfort she experiences. She becomes curious. She asks, what's actually happening here? And that doesn't mean becoming passive. It doesn't mean accepting poor behavior. It means learning the difference between observation and interpretation. If he becomes quieter, you can notice it without immediately deciding why. If he needs some space, you can allow him to have it without turning that space into evidence that you're unwanted. If something bothers you, you can communicate it without making him responsible for regulating every emotion you feel. That is emotional maturity, and here's why it matters so much. People feel psychologically safe around someone who doesn't constantly turn every moment into a trial. Imagine being with someone who interprets everything you do. You take a little longer to respond, and there's an argument. You have a stressful day, and suddenly you're accused of not caring. You disagree about something, and instead of discussing the disagreement, you're forced to defend your entire character. Over time, you don't feel loved, you feel monitored, and when people feel monitored, they often become less emotionally open. They stop saying what they're really thinking. They become careful. They edit themselves. They avoid vulnerability because vulnerability feels dangerous when you don't trust what the other person will do with it. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine being with someone who can say, I noticed you've been a little distant lately. Is everything okay? No accusation. No performance, no psychological courtroom, just curiosity. That one sentence can create more intimacy than 10 dramatic conversations because it communicates something incredibly important. I am paying attention to you, but I'm not trying to control you. And that distinction is enormous. There is a difference between being attentive and being intrusive. There is a difference between caring and controlling. There is a difference between wanting clarity and demanding constant reassurance. A woman with emotional intelligence understands these distinctions. She doesn't suppress her needs. She expresses them. She doesn't pretend everything is fine when it isn't. She communicates. But she also understands that another human being is allowed to have an internal world she cannot completely access. And this is where relationships become philosophical, because to love another person is in part to accept that they remain separate from you. You can know them deeply without possessing them completely. You can love them without controlling every thought they have. You can ask for reassurance without demanding that they eliminate all uncertainty from your life, and that is difficult. Because uncertainty makes us uncomfortable. We want guarantees. We want to know exactly how someone feels, exactly where the relationship is going, exactly what every silence means, exactly why they behaved the way they did. But intimacy doesn't come from eliminating uncertainty. It comes from developing enough emotional security to tolerate some uncertainty while reality reveals itself. That's a very different form of strength, and a man can feel that. He can feel the difference between a woman who wants to understand him and a woman who wants to manage him. A woman who wants to understand him might say, "Tell me what you're thinking." A woman who wants to manage him might say, "Why aren't you thinking the way I want you to think?" Those sound similar on the surface. Psychologically, they're worlds apart. The first invites intimacy. The second demands compliance. And this is why one of the most attractive qualities in a relationship isn't being endlessly agreeable. It's being emotionally spacious. You can disagree with someone without making them your enemy. You can tell someone they hurt you without humiliating them. You can establish a boundary without threatening them. You can say, "I don't like that," without saying, "You are a terrible person for doing that." That is strength. And interestingly, this is also where boundaries become much more powerful, because a boundary isn't an attempt to control another person. A boundary tells someone what you will participate in. There's a huge difference. Control says, "You aren't allowed to do that." A boundary says, "If that continues, I won't remain in this situation." One attempts to govern the other person. The other governs your own choices. And once you understand that, relationships become much healthier. You stop trying to force someone to behave correctly. You start paying attention to whether their behavior is compatible with your values. That's a subtle but profound shift, because you cannot build intimacy by constantly trying to edit another human being. You have to discover them. And sometimes discovering someone means realizing that the person you hoped they were isn't the person they actually are. That's uncomfortable, but it's honest, and honesty is more valuable than fantasy. A woman who can see a man clearly doesn't idealize him just because she's attracted to him. She can appreciate his strengths while noticing his weaknesses. She can admire his confidence while recognizing arrogance. She can appreciate his independence while noticing emotional unavailability. She can enjoy his charm while still asking whether he has integrity. That is what it means to see someone. You're not blinded by attraction. You're informed by it. And there's another side to this that I think is incredibly important. A woman who truly sees a man doesn't use his vulnerability as ammunition. If he tells her about something he's insecure about, she doesn't store it away as a weapon for the next argument. If he reveals something painful from his past, she doesn't later throw it back at him to win a fight. If he admits that he's afraid, she doesn't suddenly respect him less because he showed a human side. She understands that vulnerability is not weakness. It is access. Someone has allowed you into a part of themselves that the rest of the world may never see. And what you do with that access tells them whether they were safe to open up. This is why emotional safety can become so powerful in attraction. When someone feels that they can be honest with you without being immediately judged, corrected, mocked, or controlled, something begins to happen. Their nervous system relaxes, their defenses lower, they become more themselves, and ironically, that's when you get to know the real person. Not the performance, not the polished version, not the version designed to impress you, the person underneath. But don't misunderstand this. Being emotionally safe does not mean being endlessly tolerant. You can create safety and still have standards. You can understand why someone behaves badly without excusing the behavior. You can have compassion for someone's wounds without volunteering to be wounded by them. That distinction will become incredibly important as we move into the final part of this conversation. Because the strongest woman isn't the woman who understands a man's pain so completely that she accepts anything. She's the woman who can understand his pain while still respecting her own. She can say, "I understand why you're struggling," and also say, "But I won't allow your struggle to become an excuse for hurting me." That's emotional intelligence at its highest level. Not choosing between compassion and self-respect, holding both, and perhaps that's what makes a woman genuinely different. She doesn't need to control a man to feel secure. She doesn't need to decode every silence. She doesn't need to win every argument. She doesn't need to make him dependent on her. She simply creates an environment where two adults can tell the truth. And if he is emotionally mature, that kind of relationship can feel extraordinary, because for perhaps the first time, he isn't being asked to perform. He's being invited to participate, and there is a profound difference. The woman who controls him may get his compliance. The woman who understands him may get his trust, and trust is where attraction stops being a game and starts becoming a relationship. So don't aim to become the woman who knows every trick for keeping a man's attention. Become the woman who can look at a man clearly, listen deeply, communicate honestly, and still remain rooted in herself. Because when a man feels truly seen by a woman who cannot be easily manipulated, he experiences something rare: acceptance without surrender, intimacy without control, and connection without losing himself. And that kind of woman doesn't simply get noticed, she gets remembered. This final section brings the speech to its emotional conclusion. Self-respect, standards, and the ability to walk away without abandoning yourself. I'll keep the same intellectual, conversational relationship, coaching qualities without directly imitating any specific living speaker. And this brings us to perhaps the most powerful thing about a woman who is genuinely different. She knows how to leave. Not because she doesn't care, not because she never gets attached, not because she is playing some elaborate game where she wants a man to fear losing her. She knows how to leave because there is a point at which loving someone cannot require abandoning yourself. And I think this is one of the hardest lessons in relationships, because when we really like someone, we become tempted to negotiate against our own standards. We say, maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe I should be more understanding. Maybe if I give it a little more time, he'll change. Maybe if I love him enough, he'll eventually see what we could have. And sometimes patience is wisdom. Sometimes people genuinely need time. Sometimes relationships go through difficult seasons. But there is a difference between giving someone room to grow and repeatedly lowering the standard by which you allow yourself to be treated. And that difference matters because there is something psychologically dangerous about staying in situations that repeatedly violate your own values. Every time you tell yourself this isn't okay, and then remain without addressing it, you teach yourself something. You teach yourself that your own boundaries are negotiable. You teach yourself that your discomfort doesn't matter. You teach yourself that keeping another person is more important than keeping your relationship with yourself. And eventually, you may still have the relationship, but you no longer recognize the person you became to maintain it. That's the real danger. Losing someone hurts, but losing yourself while trying not to lose someone can be far more devastating. And this is why a woman with standards can be so powerful. She isn't constantly threatening to leave. She isn't announcing her boundaries every 5 minutes. She doesn't use the possibility of abandonment as a weapon. She simply knows what she will and will not participate in, and because she knows that, her yes means something. Her affection means something. Her commitment means something. Her presence means something because it isn't automatic. It's chosen, and chosen love is fundamentally different from dependent love. Dependent love says, "I'll stay because I don't know who I am without you." Chosen love says, "I am here because I genuinely want to be here." Those words may sound similar. Emotionally, they are worlds apart. One is fear, the other is freedom. And here's the paradox. The more capable you are of walking away from what diminishes you, the more capable you become of staying in something healthy. Because you're no longer staying out of fear, you're staying because the relationship continues to deserve your presence. That changes the entire dynamic. You don't have to tolerate disrespect simply because you're afraid of being alone. You don't have to accept inconsistency because you're afraid there won't be someone else. You don't have to convince someone to choose you. You don't have to compete with another woman for basic consideration. You don't have to prove that you're worthy of effort. And perhaps most importantly, you don't have to turn yourself into someone else just to become easier to love. Because there is a profound psychological cost to constantly performing for affection, you become hyper-aware of yourself. You start wondering whether you're too emotional, too independent, too affectionate, too ambitious, too quiet, too outspoken, too much, and eventually you stop asking, "Is this person right for me?" You start asking, "How can I become the person this individual will finally accept?" That's the wrong question. The better question is, can I be fully myself in this relationship and still feel respected? Because the right relationship should not require the destruction of your personality. Growth, absolutely. Maturity, absolutely. Learning better communication, of course. But growth is not the same thing as self-erasure. And a man who is emotionally healthy will understand that. He may not agree with every boundary you have. He may not always understand your perspective immediately, but he will recognize that you are a person with an interior world, values, needs, and limits. He doesn't have to control them, and you don't have to control his. That's what adult love looks like. Two people who are free enough to choose each other. And this is why walking away can sometimes create a deeper impression than endless persuasion ever could. Because when someone realizes that you are willing to leave a relationship rather than betray yourself, they understand something about you. Your love has conditions, not conditions of perfection. Conditions of dignity. You can make mistakes and still be loved. You can have bad days and still be loved. You can disagree and still be loved. But contempt, manipulation, repeated dishonesty, cruelty, and fundamental disrespect cannot become the price of staying connected. That's not love. That's self-abandonment disguised as loyalty. And there is a difference between loyalty and attachment. Loyalty says, I will stand beside you while we both do the work. Attachment says, I will tolerate almost anything because I am terrified of losing you. One builds something. The other slowly destroys the person doing the tolerating. And I want you to think about what happens when a woman no longer fears being alone. She becomes less impressed by empty promises. She becomes more attentive to patterns. She stops asking, what did he say? And starts asking, what does he consistently do? That's maturity. Because words tell you what someone wants you to believe, patterns tell you what you can actually expect. A man can tell you that he cares, but does he show up? He can tell you that you're important, but does his behavior reflect that? He can tell you that he's afraid of losing you, but does he actually create a relationship worth staying in? You don't have to answer these questions through endless interrogation. You can simply observe. And observation is one of the greatest forms of emotional power because it removes you from the exhausting role of trying to persuade someone into becoming different. You stop arguing with reality. You start accepting it. If he is inconsistent, you see it. If he's emotionally unavailable, you see it. If he treats you with kindness and consistency, you see that too. You don't need to manipulate the outcome. You need to gather information and then you make a decision. That is what self-respect looks like in practice. It isn't a quote on a social media post. It isn't walking away dramatically so someone will chase you. It is the quiet ability to say, this isn't right for me, and mean it. Sometimes that decision will cost you someone you love. And that's the painful part nobody likes to talk about. Having standards doesn't guarantee that you won't experience heartbreak. In fact, sometimes your standards are precisely what cause you to walk away from someone you deeply wanted. But heartbreak doesn't mean you made the wrong decision. Sometimes heartbreak is simply the emotional price of refusing to betray yourself. And eventually, something changes. You stop seeing being chosen as the ultimate prize. You realize that mutual choice is the prize. You don't want someone who eventually gives in after you have spent months convincing them. You want someone who recognizes your value and willingly participates in building something with you. That's a different standard, and it creates a different kind of relationship. So when we say, you're not like other women, and that shakes him, don't interpret that as a competition between women. Your goal isn't to be better than another woman. Your goal is to become more deeply yourself, because there will always be someone more beautiful. Someone funnier, someone younger, someone more outgoing, someone who appears more mysterious. If your confidence depends on being superior to other women, your confidence will always be fragile. But if your confidence comes from knowing who you are, what you value, what you offer, and what you will no longer compromise, then comparison loses its power. You don't need to be the most desirable woman in the room. You need to be the woman who doesn't abandon herself when someone doesn't choose her. And ironically, that is often what makes someone extraordinarily compelling, because there is a steadiness to her. She can love without clinging. She can communicate without manipulating. She can forgive without forgetting. She can be vulnerable without becoming dependent. She can stay without losing herself, and she can leave without needing revenge. That's strength, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it is already present in every decision she makes. And perhaps this is the final lesson. The woman who truly shakes a man isn't the woman who has mastered how to make him chase. She's the woman who has stopped making her life about being chased. She has built a life she respects. She has developed a mind she trusts. She has learned to love without losing herself. And when she chooses a man, he understands that her love is not an act of desperation. It is an act of discernment. She isn't saying, "I need you to complete me." She's saying, "I have a full life, a full heart, and a clear sense of who I am. If you enter this life, I want you to add to it, not replace it." And that is the kind of love that creates respect. Because ultimately, the most unforgettable woman isn't the one who makes a man afraid to lose her. She's the one who knows that losing herself would be far more costly. So love deeply, give generously, be vulnerable, but never make another person's decision to stay the condition for your decision to value yourself. Because the moment you know you can walk away from what dishonors you, you stop begging to be chosen, and you become free to choose. And freedom is the most powerful form of attraction there is.